Support for Faith on Trial and Iowa Catholic Radio provided in part by Imogene Ingredients.
Our freedom of conscience and religion is being challenged by laws and regulations imposed by secular society. It's time to hear from the top Christian litigators in the nation who have come forward to tell us the truth and help us defend our faith.
Hear ye, hear ye. All rise. Faith on Trial with Defender of the Faith, Deacon Mike Mano, is in session.
Welcome once again to Faith on Trial. We missed everybody last week during our fundraiser where we were kind of, I guess, preempted.
Yeah, it was fun to listen to everyone on the station last week.
Yes, it was. But anyway, just in case you wanted to donate some funds to us to help us out, and you've not had a chance to do that, you can go to 515-223-1150 or go to our website, iowacatholicradio.com, and pledge those funds, and we can still use some extra money. We always, we're a nonprofit. We always can use extra money. But and if you can't donate, keep us in your prayers, because we try and do those things that and point out to you those things that you need to know to understand what the world is going through right now. And want to thank Maggie DeWitty last week, or the week before last, for sitting in for Gina.
Yes, thanks, Maggie.
Gina is back now.
I am.
We found her. We drug her back, and she's here now. All right, we have an interesting program today. We're going to have Joe Davis, who is an attorney with the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, on a case that was just, I don't want to say it was lost by the Supreme Court. It was not heard by the Supreme Court, and so we're stuck with kind of a very sad outcome in the state of Indiana from the Indiana courts about a child who identified as something other than his born gender. And the parents, who were Catholics, wanted to treat him for underlying causes. And anyway, the long story is that the kid was taken away from them and has, I guess, grown up in a foster home now because he's, I guess, turned 18. So we'll talk about that and what it means for the future, and or what it might not mean for the future. We'll see. And then our old friend Sarah Parshall Perry, who is senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, who is going to be talking to us about a proposed law in South Carolina that would protect children from certain medical procedures involving transgenderism. So that's what we have today. I think you're going to find it interesting. And do we have a prayer to open us up with, Gina?
I do. I have a prayer for peace today. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of peace, bring your peace into our violent world. Peace in the hearts of all men and women, and peace among the nations of this earth. Turn to your way of love those whose hearts and minds are consumed with hatred. Strengthen us all in hope, and give us the wisdom and the courage to work tirelessly for a world where true peace and love reign among the nations and in the hearts of all. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Gina. We'll be right back after these messages with Joe Davis from the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. You're listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. And welcome back. You're listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network, and we have with us right now Joe Davis, who is an attorney with the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. And he has I guess, kind of a sad story to tell us about a case that they did not win, but I think it has some broader applications. So, Joe, why don't you start off and tell us what the case is all about here?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. So this case, as you said, is really a tragic story. It's about a chilling incursion into parental rights and religious liberty. So back in 2021, the state of Indiana launched an investigation into Mary and Jeremy Cox, who are two parents who live there. And the reason for the investigation is that the Coxes, as faithful Catholics, they would not refer to their son, who was identifying as transgender, by his preferred female name and female pronouns. Now, the state then removed custody of the Cox's child from them, took him out of their home, and placed him in a home that would affirm his new gender identity. And then the state went even further. It imposed a gag order on Mary and Jeremy, and it said, in the limited visitation time that you now have with your own child, you're not allowed to speak about issues of gender and sexuality with your own child. So this was really an obvious violation of the First Amendment, an obvious violation of parental rights. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court declined to hear this case, but the Coxes are going to continue advocating for parental rights and religious liberty, and we fully expect this to be an issue that the Supreme Court takes up in the near future.
Now, this is in Indiana, correct?
That's correct.
And Indiana isn't, I don't think we see as necessarily a blue state. But the Coxes, I guess, lost the first round in the district court and then lost in the appellate level within the state.
That's right. And I think you raised a good point about Indiana. I mean, what this case illustrates is that, this can really happen to anybody. It can happen anywhere. I think in a lot of states, even those that you would associate as being more parental rights friendly, less ideological on these issues, you see sort of Department of Child Services agencies or lower-level bureaucrats that are very ideological on these issues, and they can sort of operate in their own sphere before really the state's leadership has a lot of insight into what's going on. The really disappointing thing here is that at the Supreme Court, the state's leaders actually came in and sort of ran cover for what their Department of Child Services did, said it was really about this issue or that issue and not about the gender dispute. So it was very disappointing to see, but you're right to note the Indiana aspect. I mean, if it can happen in Indiana, it can happen anywhere, and in fact, it is happening elsewhere right now.
Okay, now I noticed that they appealed from the state Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. Now, I can kind of understand why the U.S. Supreme Court might decline to hear a local case like this. It comes out of an administrative agency, especially considering everything else they have on their plate. But I was a little surprised why they didn't take the case, even though I understand perhaps why. Did they give any indication why the case was declined, or was it just a one-order case is declined?
Yeah, no, they didn't give any explanation, and they typically don't, as I'm sure you know.
Right.
They issue an order that says certiorari denied. But it's hard to say exactly why they did that. Obviously, we're disappointed as well. They get asked to hear thousands of cases every year. They can only hear a small handful. And, sometimes one thing that may have been an issue here is sometimes they're a little hesitant to take sort of the first example of a particular dispute that hits their desk, right? They like to let the issue kind of percolate around. Now, that's very damaging for the Coxes, right, whose own rights were at issue in this case. But I think we can fully expect the court to have this issue on its radar now, and to take up this issue and to rule, hopefully the right way in the very near future. And these cases are going to keep happening. Unfortunately, the denial here may actually embolden ideological state agencies elsewhere. But even right now, there was a similar kind of custody dispute in Montana very recently involving facts similar to what were going on in this case. Around the country, you've got school districts that will, secretly allow a child to transition without informing the child's parents. So a very similar type of issue there. You've got other states that have actually affirmatively enacted laws. So, for example, Washington has a law that says, if a minor runs away and it's because they're not allowed to obtain gender-affirming care at home, we're not going to tell the parents about that. We're going to take the child in and allow them to seek gender-affirming care. So
I want to ask you about what's going on in Washington, because I know there's some companion cases up there. And at the same time your case here came out, there was another case that was filed. I think ADF filed it in Washington over foster care parenting, where a foster care family who was in the same position as the Coxes were in, only they were not their children, but they were being evaluated to renew the foster care license. They were turned down, and I think Oregon has done the same thing as well. So we can expect to see this in certain states, but in Indiana, I did not expect to see it. But going back to the Supreme Court, and I think you touched on something that came to my mind as I read this, that could the Supreme Court be looking for a better case to make the argument?
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're right to. I think there's every reason to expect them to take this issue up again soon. I'm not sure. This case actually had a very clean sort of presentation of the issue, right? The Department of Child Services said, we're doing this investigation because of this complaint about pronouns. It said this child needs to be placed in a home where he will be affirmed. So you do have, it really teeing up this question of, can the state take away a child because of a dispute over gender identity? But, there's every reason to expect the case, the issue to land on their desk again, and I do expect them to take it up.
Will there be an attempt, or has there been any talk about an attempt to terminate parental rights?
Well, the child in this case is now over the age of 18, so that sort of makes the case especially tragic, in that the removal of custody, ultimately became permanent. And that was one of the things that Indiana said to the Supreme Court. Don't take this case. The child's now 18. Unfortunately, if that were the rationale for the court to not take it up, it would never be able to take up one of these cases, because very often the dispute arises with teenagers, right? Frequently that age is actually going down, unfortunately, these days, but it's very often teenagers. And the court system takes a long time to work through, right? This case had to go through sort of the administrative level, through the Indiana courts, and then finally to the Supreme Court years later. So that really can't be a reason to not take up one of these cases. And if it is, then you've got a recipe written down for hostile states to take away children and ensure that the Supreme Court can never intervene.
Yeah, it seems to me that's why the Supreme Court, or how the Supreme Court ultimately took Roe versus Wade. The woman had already given birth, but they said, "Hey, this could happen again, so we ought to take a look at this."
You're exactly right. Yeah, it's to use the legal terminology, it's called capable of repetition.
Capable of repetition, right? Mm-hmm.
That's right. And all it means is, if this dispute kind of by its very nature is going to be short-lived, but it can also repeat. It can happen in lots of other scenarios. There's got to be a way for courts to answer the question, like, is this a violation of the Constitution or not? Mm-hmm. And you're right that that's one of the leading examples, but there are plenty of others that have not been overruled.
Okay. Gina, did you have something?
Oh, I mostly wanted to know if this is something that's specific to a law in Indiana. You talk about the possibility in other states or other homes, and I wonder if it's just very particular to the laws in that state.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the answer is no. The law that the state sort of pointed to here was a law that said if a child is a danger to his or herself, right, the state can intervene and take the child away, sort of in the best interest of the child. And they said, here there's this. The child is identifying as transgender. He's not being affirmed in the home, and therefore he's endangered himself. He has this eating disorder that he says is because of this, conflict with his parents. But I think that sort of rationale is very easily repeatable across the country. I mean, tragically, children who identify as transgender, who struggle with issues of gender dysphoria, very frequently have what are called comorbidities, other issues that are going on, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, things like this. And there's this raging dispute over, in the medical community, what's the best way to treat a child like that? And you have sort of an ideological answer, which is affirm. But you have lots of doctors on the other hand saying, no, you can treat the comorbidity and then let the child sort of age out of the gender dysphoria. This very, very frequently happens, and there's no good evidence to show that affirming the child will help with the comorbidities. There's actually quite a lot of evidence that it doesn't help, and in fact, causes all these other harms like permanent sterilization, things like that. So that's what the Coxes wanted to do. They wanted to treat the eating disorder. They wanted to, consistent with their religious beliefs and also with their views about how to help their own child, not affirm his gender identity, treat him as their son, and that's what the state said they couldn't do.
Okay. Do we know who made the complaint?
Yeah, how does a complaint like this bubble to the surface and become to the attention of the state?
Yeah, it was an anonymous complaint, and I think we'll have to leave it there for our purposes now. But that's what makes it sort of so chilling, right? A parent could an anonymous complaint could sort of tip off the state. It could be filed by an ideological actor, who just disagrees with what the parents are doing and teaching in their own home. And it could launch an investigation like this. And
I know in my experience in court, you never did find out who they were, or weren't supposed to anyway, which kind of tied your hands behind your back a little bit.
Yeah, it's certainly it's under seal. It's under seal in this litigation.
Yeah. Okay.
So, from a non-legal standpoint, I look at this and I think a parent has a right to teach their children their religious beliefs. So, where does this case fall on the rights under the First Amendment of a parent to educate their child?
Yeah, I mean, every parent, religious or not, has a right to educate their own child with their views. That's been a long settled issue a long settled question by the U.S. Supreme Court. But then there's an additional sort of religious liberty overlay here. Like, parents have a right to raise their child in their own religious beliefs and to convey those beliefs to their child. So you've got, two sort of overlapping constitutional protections that were entirely ignored here. And then you add in the speech angle. The Coxes here were there was a gag order saying that they couldn't speak to their own child about their beliefs about gender in their visitation. So this really is an area where there are multiple sort of vigorous overlapping constitutional protections for parental rights. But it's, in order for those protections to do their work, you've got to have the Supreme Court step in and reaffirm them. That's what we hope they would do here, but we fully expect them to do it in another case.
Now, at some point, since this case really is moot, since the child is over 18, can he decide to just come back and live with his parents? Or is there another prohibition against him doing that?
Yeah, well, he's 18. You're right. So there's no prohibition. That's what the parent, the Coxes love their son and want to be his loving parents, and that's certainly their fervent hope that there could be that sort of reconciliation. Obviously, that's kind of beyond the scope of what was at issue in the litigation. But yes, you're right.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. So where do we see all of this going? Because we see a lot of attacks on parental rights, and it seemed to me until I read about this case the other day that what was happening is it looked like we were winning most of those, but we're losing them in the areas where we'd expect to lose them, like you say, in these deep blue states like Oregon and Washington, where they're fighting the foster care stuff. And I think Minnesota just the other day, not to change the subject again on you, Joe, but I think in Minnesota, the legislative committee just rejected a religious exception for a new civil liberties or civil rights type bill that they were proposing in the legislature that would, again, in this area, clamp down on what parents could say or do.
Yeah, I think you're right to recognize the nationwide scope of the issue, and there's really several different sort of sub-varieties. So there are kind of school curriculum disputes where parents are asserting a right to opt out of school curriculum that's hostile to their religious beliefs. And we at Beckett have a case like that in Montgomery County, Maryland. We're representing this hugely diverse group of parents, Muslim parents, Christian parents, Jewish parents, who have a problem with sort of the sexuality propaganda that's being pushed on their children. they're very young children and are seeking sort of a right to opt out. So that's one variety of a parental rights case in this sort of area. There are the foster care cases that you pointed to, and Beckett, we have a couple of cases like that right now. We have a case in Massachusetts involving that same issue, where prospective foster parents are being disqualified. You can't be a foster parent if, in some hypothetical, in the hypothetical situation down the line that a child is identifying as a different gender, you're not able to affirm that. You actually think they ought to continue identifying with their biological sex. And then there's, these sort of custody disputes, which is what the Cox's situation was, which is maybe the most extreme example, but it's also an example that's kind of tied up in particular facts in some ways. So I think you're right to identify several different varieties of what's ultimately sort of a similar question, which is what are the scope of parents' rights, vis-a-vis the state, to convey their own beliefs about issues of gender and sexuality rather than being forced to parrot the ones that are popular among state bureaucrats. So I think we're going to win these cases, and we're going to have parental rights strongly reaffirmed in the very near future. But there's a lot of people that are going to be harmed in the interim unless the court steps in quickly.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead, Gene, if you have.
Oh, I think the fact that you address the harm to the children is incredibly important in this case and all the cases. That's why it's interesting. As I sit here and I listen to the legal conversation, I am pondering, do we work with our legislatures to specifically prohibit the state or any agency if they're stepping in to the family? I could think of all these parental rights bills that have been passed, especially in Iowa in the last 4 years. Do we need to go further? Is that one way to address this problem and give parents their families back?
Yeah, I think there are, of course, legislative solutions to these kind of questions. That's we're more on the litigation side of things, which is where we.
And we're happy you are, because you do a lot of good for us.
Well, I'm grateful for that.
Yes.
Yeah,
we'll talk more about Beckett in a minute, but let's go ahead and finish.
Oh yeah, sure. And I was just going to step in on that and say, there are plenty of states that are recognizing the harms that radical gender ideology is imposing on children. You have a lot of states where it's actually unlawful to perform certain gender transition procedures on children. Ironically, one of those states is Indiana, the same state that then came in and ran cover for their Department of Child Services in this case. So obviously, the law in the books is not always going to be the solution. This case is a prime example of that. But pursuing sort of legislative initiatives can be very important.
All right. The other question that I had here before we move on to another topic is religious animus. How much of this appears to be coming from religious animus? Because I read reports where somebody in the foster care department found out that somebody was an evangelical, or somebody was a Roman Catholic, or somebody was whatever religion, didn't embrace LGBT rights and trans rights. And that's what ticked the whole thing off. Are you seeing that too?
Yeah, there's a lot of troubling situations like that that you see out there. Where parents are being, the foster care cases that we were talking about a minute ago, parents are being sort of quizzed on their religious beliefs and what their church teaches on these issues. I think it's an unfortunate world in which some people on both sides of the issues associate people of faith with being hateful on LGBT issues, et cetera, where it's really what it is a view about the reality of the human person and a view about the best way to help somebody who's struggling with gender dysphoria. What the Coxes thought was what's ultimately going to be helpful for their child, what's ultimately going to help him find peace, is to accept his God-given sex, his God-given body. And that's really what's at issue here. It's not the things that are raised by the states in some of the scenarios.
Yeah, this whole issue seems to be more of a social contagion than a medical problem.
I think there's quite a lot of evidence of that. You see the skyrocketing rates of gender dysphoria and or transgender identification. You think could it really have always been like that, or is it because people are seeing it in their peers? Right.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Beckett. We haven't had you on for a while, but we have regularly had Beckett on as one of our guests. We understand that what you do pro bono.
That's exactly right. We're a nonprofit law firm. We're entirely pro bono to our own clients, supported by generous donors who believe in our mission. And what we do is we represent people of all faiths, and we fight for their free expression of their faith in the public sphere. And we like to say, from A to Z, from Anglicans to Zoroastrians, that's who we represent. We have an undefeated record at the United States Supreme Court, and we're delighted to be on your show every time that you invite us.
Oh, certainly. And people can find out more about what you do by going to your webpage, which I think is Beckett.org. Is that correct?
We're at BeckettLaw.org.
We're BeckettLaw.org.
On social media, Beckett on X, and that's how you can keep up with us. And
we're just finishing up with our fundraiser here, but in case anybody has any spare change left over, Beckett might be a nice place to park that, because I'm sure you can put that to good use.
Absolutely.
Very good. Very good. All right, that's BeckettLaw.org. If anybody wants to find anything more out about Beckett, and I must say they've got a great web page tracking all of their cases and a few others that aren't even their own. And so I would urge anybody who has a chance to go there and check that out. You can read about all these things. Joe, I want to thank you for joining us today. Certainly appreciate it, and we wish you well with all the cases you have right now. And I hope the Coxes are able to reunite and patch up their differences and become a family again.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Certainly. Thank you very much. God bless you. You're listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network, and we will be right back after these messages. Okay, welcome back. You're still listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network, and we have with us right now one of our favorite guests that we've had over the years, Sarah Parshall Perry, who is Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Institute. So, Sarah, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, and I want to talk to you about what's going on in South Carolina and what that may mean for the rest of the country. But why don't we start by explaining what this Help Not Harm bill is that they're debating right now.
Yeah, so in South Carolina, a bill has just passed out of the House, and it's headed toward the Senate for a vote within the next few days, we anticipate, on restrictions for so-called gender-affirming procedures for minors under the age of 18. And these include gender-altering surgeries and medications like cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers, and they are exceptionally aggressive treatments for individuals under the age of 18. And in their good thinking, and I think their sort of moral character, the individuals in the South Carolina House have recognized that this is something that they need to take into their own hands, because we're seeing this sort of proliferation of individuals who are in minor populations identifying as transgender and who are being medicalized into sort of a path, a trajectory that they cannot extricate themselves from unless individuals stand up, mature adults stand up and say, we need to let kids develop normally. And then when they're older, if this is something that they're still struggling with, we can have those conversations then. But there is a precipitous rise in the number of individuals identifying as transgender within the 12 to 17-year-old cohort in America. In fact, about a year and a half ago, UCLA School of Law's Williams Institute published a report indicating that about 300,000 of American teenagers in that age range now identify as transgender. Well, that's the biggest growing population cohort of transgender individuals in America. So we are seeing sort of these dual-track phenomenons. One, the increase in the number of young people who believe themselves to be born in the wrong body. And two, the number of medical professionals willing to take advantage of this zeitgeist and really make money off procedures that are nothing short of barbaric.
And we talked about this a little bit earlier in our program before you got on. This seems more like a social contagion than a real medical problem.
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt. In fact, Abigail Schreier, a Wall Street Journal reporter, wrote a book called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And that really is sort of a great explanation of how this came to be. She talks very much about the influence of peer pressure, the influence of social media, and the influence of government elites who are pushing forward these talking points on the fact that gender-affirming care is life-saving and that trans people will die without it. Well, that's just a patent falsehood because this, quote, gender-affirming care doesn't solve anything. This is an underlying internal subjective sense of self that cannot be fixed by mutilation of the physical body. And we understand, obviously, that God does not make mistakes. There are two sexes, and we are immutably, correctly created with exactly the Creator's design. And these poor individuals are not healed by going through these procedures, but rather they are actually in many ways damaged. And the new data indicates that these individuals actually, when they go through gender transition, can't express more suicidality than before they've had the procedures to begin with.
Yeah. And I noticed you on the bill, it was for, procedures, banning certain procedures and not just care, because I think that's a euphemism that's always used, is gender-affirming care. But I'm glad to see that they're actually using the word procedures now. The whole thing seems to be kind of an argument now between scripture and biology versus ideology.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. This really is, I think, an expression of the newest iteration of cultural Marxism, right? So first, in the 60s and 70s, it was the destruction of the nuclear family, and now we've gotten into destruction of institutions, and now we're turning toward destruction of the self, right? So if we take apart those guardrails for society and humanity that have been created from time immemorial, we really start to see exactly how these very noxious philosophies can catch hold. And it really is sort of a mind virus, isn't it? It's very easy, particularly in this young generation. And listen, I'm the parent of three teenagers, 15, 17, and 19. I have had up close and personal exposure to friends of theirs who have just utterly been sold the snake oil from the transgender movement. And this really is, at its bottom, it's sexual fetishism. That was a very, very minor percentage of the population, classified, by the way, up until about 2014 by the American Psychiatric Association to be a mental illness. Now, why we've suddenly treated this as some kind of vaunted politically protected status just indicates exactly how quickly this has transpired and sort of how far the wildfire has spread, but it also indicates to us exactly how strong we have to stand for truth, for biblical reality, for biological and scientific reality, and really not bend the knee. It's simply that a very small, well-funded, and loud cohort of the population has sort of bullied a good portion of America into thinking that trans people will die if kids don't get this, quote, gender-affirming care, or biological men aren't allowed to play on the sports teams with biological women, or allowed to go into the bathrooms that comport with their gender identity regardless of what their underlying biological sex is. And we're seeing some of these manifestations, whether it's in injuries in women's sports, whether it's in sexual assault and abuse cases and women's correctional facilities where transgender inmates are housed with women. It's really something that's taken off, and it's almost like a game of whack-a-mole because we're trying very quickly to address every manifestation of the transgender mind virus, and it really has infected every aspect of American society.
It seems to be focusing on young people, and I'm wondering what real contributions the teachers in the public schools are making to this, because it seems like there's a lot of rhetoric coming from the schools and from kids in school who are listening to teachers, and that's, I think, where a lot of that is being kindled.
Yeah. There's no point, and part of that is because the teaching colleges, those higher education institutions, have been beholden to the left for a very, very long time. Academia has been sold out to the left for a very long time. In the liberal arts, for example, only 3% of professors in higher education identify themselves as being centrist or right of center. So these individuals are going to get their teaching degrees, their teaching certifications. They are going back into the public schools with all of this ideology already cemented. And what they're doing is they're really sort of rubber stamping a new generation of little Marxist apologists. And I don't think that's an overstatement. I mean, if COVID did anything for American parents, it gave us an opportunity to look over the shoulders of our children and to realize exactly what they were experiencing. And I was a full beneficiary of that. When I was home, I was actually working in the Trump administration at the Department of Education, and here's the height of irony, as one of the senior attorneys there. And I was working from home while my children were also schooling from home, and we could hear what was happening in the classroom. We could evaluate the lessons as they were actually being taught. We could hear the rhetoric from the teachers, and it was, I think, startling for many American parents. But the impact of public education, I don't think, can be overstated, because this is much of, I think, where the origin of this sort of philosophy is stemming from.
Well, that's the target, I think, of the Communist Party, and it goes back, I think, probably to the 1880s or so. But I know the Communist Party made a big move to involve their members in teachers' unions, and I know Bella Dodd, who was leading Communist Party member, was a leader in the teachers' unions in New York, and that seems to have played out. I mean, she was at Hunter College, but I think it spread beyond there into Columbia and all sorts of other places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gina, did you?
Sarah, I know that there's about half the country has enacted some sort of legislation to prohibit this in the states, despite the fact that our federal government is promoting it. In Iowa, and I know Tennessee, as they enacted this legislation, what they found is that their state-funded hospital system, through their universities, were engaging in this activity and heavily financially profiting from it. In South Carolina, is there a pushback from the hospital system? Do they have that same situation there in South Carolina?
Yeah, in fact, all of the federally funded hospital systems in America, and this is really sort of coming to crescendo, Gina, it's going to be something I think we're going to see more of in the coming days. What we're seeing now is a clash of federal anti-discrimination law from the federal government under HHS's Obamacare mandate, and that's a portion called Section 1557, and that is a non-discrimination provision in the federal funding system for healthcare clinics, medical hospitals, for medical providers, that indicates there can be no discrimination based on gender or gender identity. But what we're seeing now is sort of this clash of the titans, right? We've got doctors who may, for example, have conscience rights coming up against having to make the Hobson's choice of whether or not they want to continue working at a hospital. That might be a very profitable, personable choice for them, employment choice for them, and yet they're being forced into these paradigms where they're having to make these choices on whether or not they will perform these gender-affirming surgeries surgeries. And again, money talks, but I like to tell people within the gender identity movement, it screams. Many of these hospitals are not willing to turn down hundreds and thousands of dollars in federal funding and Medicaid, Medicare, Obamacare funding because they want to be able to continue profiting off this particular medical zeitgeist. I think it really is something that we're going to see playing out in the future. But many of the hospitals that have represented themselves to not be performing some of these gender-affirming procedures have been discovered later, including children's hospitals like St. Louis Children's Hospital, to have been performing them all along. So we're not even clear as to the number of hospitals performing these particular procedures on minor children because the data is not required to be reported to the federal government. And that's proving to be sort of a bit slippery for individuals like our organization at the Heritage Foundation to push back against this data to get a handle on exactly how widespread the problem is.
Well, and I think you talk about the medical professionals providing this quote-unquote care. And when we look to our neighbors over on the other side of the world, the European countries have scaled back and are now beginning to prohibit it and finding the negative consequences because they're years ahead of us in trying this experiment and found that it's horribly gone wrong.
Yeah, in fact, the greater part of Western Europe, Finland, Sweden, Norway, the UK, and to a certain extent France, have all backed off these earlier affirm only, affirm often type models for gender-affirming care because they're realizing, well, we pushed for this, and we told everyone that, for example, the drugs that we started these children on, which, by the way, are chemical castration drugs. Lupron, for example, was given to sex offenders in prison to chemically castrate them. So these are not without side effects. And now we're beginning to see, after now close to a decade of use on some of these minor populations, the effects on everything from blood pressure to bone density to propensity for even a liver cancer and insterility. So this is really something, I think, where Europe, for once, has really expressed the better part of sort of caution and analysis on this, and they are waving a warning flag to the United States that, at least under this political administration, our country is refusing to heed.
Do you suppose that part of that may be that a lot of these systems in the nations that you mentioned are government systems? In other words, there's not the profit necessarily to be made out of these things than there is in the United States.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt. In fact, some general estimates based on exactly how much money is involved in the gender, quote, medicine business is roughly $3 billion. That's $3 billion a year. So the doctors who are participating, hospital systems who offer these procedures, the clinicians who are so quick to give out these cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers to minor children after one telehealth phone call without any follow-up, without any mental health counseling, without addressing the underlying comorbidities. And by the way, we know 62% of the minors who express gender incongruity have comorbid mental health diagnoses. Without any of these questions being asked, I think we truly have the makings of a lost generation on our hands.
Well, and it's a lifetime of medical care. I mean, once you have them in your care, that they'll need you as a provider for the rest of their life.
They're a lifetime paycheck for these people.
Absolutely.
You talk about the cohort growing of these young people who are identifying as transgender. But I read an article that also said there's a growing cohort of the detransitioning individuals who are becoming very vocal about how they were tricked into this kind of medical care. I imagine a lot of that will help move this legislation through the South Carolina legislature.
Yeah, the number of detransitioners, I think, is going to help significantly. We've seen 3 pretty significant medical malpractice suits out of California against Kaiser Permanente and their medical system for fast-tracking the transition of 3 adolescent girls, all of whom had underlying mental health diagnoses that were not addressed. Everything from autism spectrum disorder to ADHD to bipolar disorder. And these are women, young girls, who were given mastectomies at the age of 14, 15, 16. I mean, what was done to them is truly unconscionable. But I think as the number begins to rise of these detransitioners, as their stories are highlighted, I think it'll present some, much needed hope for individuals like us who are pushing back on the narrative from the gender identity movement, because these are individuals whose stories matter, and they were essentially sacrificial lambs for the sake of an identity that really needs as many people as possible to speak out against.
Very good.
Yeah, and people that are interested can find out more by going to, it's heritage.org. Is that the...
Heritage.org is where everyone can find my writing. Just search up my staff name, and I do a lot of commentary, analysis, and sharing of some of the research that's breaking on my Twitter profile at Sarah P. Perry.
Okay, very good. Well, we certainly appreciate you joining us here today. It's an eye-opener. Just one final question. Where do you see this all going in the immediate future?
Well, I think we're going to see continued momentum in the states. A colleague and I have written a legal memo on how the state bans on these gender procedures for minors are entirely constitutional. But right now, there are no fewer than 3 cases pending in front of the Supreme Court. They are being considered even as we speak on this Friday in chambers at the Supreme Court on whether or not the Supreme Court will grant these cases, specifically on state bans on these procedures coming out of Tennessee and coming out of Kentucky. So my fingers are crossed and my prayers are going up that the Supreme Court grants review and finds these state bans to be constitutional so we can protect the next generation of kids.
Very good. Well, Sarah, we want to thank you again for joining us today, and we certainly appreciate your expertise in the matter, and we wish you luck in what you are doing with this information, that you're getting it out to the right people in the right places. And I suppose, is this legal memo that you talked about, is that available online?
Absolutely. Go to heritage.org, and you can search my staff profile, and you'll see it right there.
Very good. Well, we certainly appreciate it. I want to thank you very much for joining us again today. We'll have you back. You're becoming one of our most popular guests here. So
definitely one of mine. Yes.
Happy to join you both every time you want, and I am really, really just appreciative of the encouragement and wish you all well.
Thank you very much. God bless you now, and we will speak to you again. Sarah Parshall Perry, who is a senior legal fellow with the Heritage Foundation, and Gina and I will be right back after these messages to wrap up. You're still listening to Faith on Trial on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. All right, we are back with somewhat of a roundup to the program, Gina.
Yeah, I'm very sad for our children. It makes me worry about the families that are trying to raise good and righteous men and women for the good of our country. Yeah, and what is going on with the kids, that's one of the things that bothers me, and I'm sure it does you, being a mother, absolutely,
too. Yes.
Absolutely, we see it. And, Sarah Parshall Perry, who is a guest often on the show, I love that she has children and can literally, anecdotally see a lot of what she's writing about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is kind of scary. And what about the case Joe Davis had from the Becket Fund?
We don't often talk about cases that just are duds in the end, that the Supreme Court decides they're not going to look at.
But it is kind of interesting to know that does go on. And I was surprised that this did come out of Indiana. I would have expected the courts in Indiana to be a little bit more conservative, but
yeah, I don't know a lot about Indiana, and I don't know. Do you how their courts are appointed, or are they elected, or how?
Whether like we do, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if they're elected. That may be the problem, and we're seeing a lot of that. I think with elected judges around the country, elected judges and elected prosecutors. It seems to me there's no breaks there for protection. So.
Yeah, and from what little bit I know of the court system, I often wonder how a 1940s or 50s court might see this case come before them and, throw it out.
Yeah. What in the heck is going on?
Right,
now?
Exactly. Those judges would have said the family was the most important unit of our country and do anything they could to protect the family unit.
And now they're not.
And now it seems as though we're leaning in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, I have a story here about what DeSantis signed the other day, which is limiting children under 18 on social media, but we'll get to that another day because we are running out of time. So we want to get in our defender's prayer in that. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Well, that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening to us again. On our blog this week, by the way, we have a 2-part series. It was written by the president of the Catholic League, Bill Donahue, and it's there about the Southern Poverty Law Center, which you've probably heard us speak of many times. I want you to enjoy the weekend, celebrate Easter with your family and friends. We will be here in another week. Until then, listen, pray, and don't forget to go to church and take your kids.
Our freedom of conscience and religion is being challenged by laws and regulations imposed by secular society. Faith on Trial, with Defender of the Faith, Deacon Mike Mano. Faith on Trial on Iowa Catholic Radio, iowacatholicradio.com, and the Iowa Catholic Radio app.
Support for Faith on Trial and Iowa Catholic Radio provided in part by Imogene Ingredients.